The Christmas market in Seoul on December 24th smelled like roasted chestnuts and mulled wine and the particular kind of desperation that comes with the last days before a holiday when people are running out of time to purchase the perfect gifts for the people they love. The streets of Cheonggyecheon were crowded with families and couples and the perpetually single people who visited holiday markets to convince themselves they were participating in something festive, something warm, something that included them despite their solitude. Overhead, strings of white lights created a canopy of false stars, and the cold air carried the sense of something about to happen, the way that winter nights always feel charged with potential and the possibility of transformation. Zara Chen had come to the market alone, which was unusual for her given her nature as a person who preferred the company of data to the company of people. She was 32 years old and worked as a senior data analyst for Crimson Analytics, one of the most important investment firms in Seoul, a place where the intersection of technology and capital produced the kind of wealth that could reshape economies and alter the course of nations. She had spent the past 6 months working on a project that had consumed her life entirely. A project involving the analysis of irregular financial flows through shell corporations, suspicious money transfers and patterns of capital movement that suggested something was happening outside the normal channels of legitimate business. She had not meant to discover what she discovered. She had been hired to analyze financial data for a corporate client, had been given access to certain databases and transaction records, and had been asked to identify trends and anomalies. What she had found, buried deep in layers of obfuscation and misdirection, was evidence of a network of money laundering operations that moved billions of won through legitimate-appearing businesses with the efficiency of blood through veins. The patterns were beautiful in their own way, elegant and intricate, the work of someone who understood both finance and psychology, who knew how to hide things in plain sight, who understood the particular blindness that respectable society possessed when it came to the crimes of the wealthy. Zara had done what a person with integrity was supposed to do. She had compiled her findings, had documented everything carefully, had prepared a report that was absolutely airtight and completely devastating. And then she had made a mistake. She had mentioned it to a colleague, had suggested that perhaps they should bring it to the attention of the regulatory authorities, had implied in the most delicate way possible that what they had discovered was significant enough to warrant official investigation. The colleague had reported her. Not to the authorities but to someone else, someone with interests in maintaining the secrecy of the financial flows she had uncovered. And suddenly, Zara found herself in a situation where she understood that the work she did was valuable in ways she had not anticipated, and that the data she possessed made her either very useful or very dangerous, depending on the perspective of the person who wanted to control that information. She had been scared. She had called her parents, had asked them about increasing security at their home in Busan, had made vague references to workplace complications that suggested trouble without explicitly stating what that trouble might be. She had consulted a lawyer, had begun researching emigration options, had started to understand that the comfortable life she had built might not be as stable as she had believed it to be. And then she had received an anonymous message suggesting that she attend a particular Christmas market on a particular evening, that she should walk to a specific location at a specific time, that if she did so, someone would contact her with a business proposition that might resolve her current difficulties. The message could have been a trap. Probably should have been a trap. But Zara was someone who had spent her entire career looking at data patterns, identifying likelihood, calculating probability. She had examined the message forensically, had traced its origins, had determined that it had come from someone with significant technical sophistication. And she had made the choice to attend the market, to walk to the specified location, to place herself in a position of vulnerability because the alternative, to remain in the passive position of waiting for something terrible to happen, felt worse. The location was near the food stalls, near the section of the market where vendors sold hot chocolate and roasted almonds and the kind of street food that people consumed standing up, moving through crowds, not really tasting it but simply eating it because the season demanded that they participate in these rituals. Zara had stood in this location and had waited, had felt the cold beginning to penetrate her expensive wool coat, had wondered if she had made a terrible mistake and should simply leave, should go home, should go to the police and tell them everything. That was when she saw the car. It was black and enormous, the kind of vehicle that announced its own importance through sheer mass and obvious expense. It was a Maybach, and it was pulling to the curb with the particular slowness that suggested that the driver understood their vehicle was drawing attention and was comfortable with that attention. The rear door opened and a man stood in the doorway and gestured for her to approach. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than she made in a month, and his face was arranged in an expression that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Zara approached the car. She had not intended to, had not consciously made the decision, but her legs had carried her forward as if they possessed their own intelligence, their own understanding that she was committed to this course of action. She looked at the man in the doorway, and he gestured toward the interior of the vehicle with the kind of command that did not allow for negotiation or conversation or the normal social rituals that people usually engaged in when they were meeting for the first time. "Get in," he said. She got in. The interior of the car was as expensive as the exterior, with leather so soft it felt like touching skin, with wood trim that had been lacquered to the point of becoming glossy, with a separation between the driver's compartment and the passenger area that suggested this was a car designed for people who needed to have private conversations while being transported. Zara sat on one of the rear seats, and the man who had gestured her into the vehicle sat across from her, not next to her, which she understood was a choice designed to maximize the psychological distance between them while maintaining the capability to observe each other closely. "Your name is Zara Chen," the man said. It was not a question. "You work for Crimson Analytics. You discovered certain financial irregularities. You have become a problem." The man was speaking English, which was unusual given that they were in Seoul and that Korean would have been the obvious choice. But English had a particular utility as the language of international business, as the language that allowed for the kind of deniability that came with speaking in a non-native language, as the language that suggested this conversation might involve parties from outside Korea, might involve transnational criminal organizations or international financial operations. "I don't know what you're talking about," Zara said. It was a reflexive response, the kind of thing that people said when they were confronted with the reality of their own vulnerability. But as soon as she said it, she understood how foolish it sounded, how unnecessary the denial was at this point. "You do," the man said. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with the kind of face that suggested a life spent making decisions that affected the lives of thousands without his emotional engagement being required. "And we need to discuss what we're going to do about that." The car had begun to move. Zara had not noticed the moment when the driver had engaged the transmission, but they were now part of the flow of traffic, moving through the Christmas market district toward the broader streets that would take them away from the holiday crowd and into the more industrial sections of Seoul. She felt her heart rate increase, felt the particular cold that comes with understanding that you have made a choice that has removed your agency, that has placed you in a position where other people's intentions matter more than your own. "I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me who you are," she said. She was trying to sound firm, was attempting to reclaim some kind of control over the situation, but her voice betrayed her fear. The man smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "My name is Viktor Razin. I am someone who makes decisions about things. You have discovered something that you were not supposed to discover. The question now is what we do about that." Viktor Razin. The name meant something to her, or rather, it meant several things depending on what sources you consulted. He was a businessman according to official records. He was a philanthropist who had donated significant sums to hospitals and universities. He was a businessman with interests in import-export, in real estate development, in the financial services sector. But these were the public faces of the man. The other version of Viktor Razin, the one that existed in the more confidential conversations of people who understood how money actually moved in the world, was something different entirely. He was a crime boss. He controlled a network that moved contraband and managed illegal financial flows and profited from the misery of vulnerable people. He was someone who had built an empire by understanding that the law was something that rich people could negotiate with, that violence was a negotiating tool that could be used when negotiation proved insufficient, that the world rewarded ruthlessness and punished mercy. "I didn't steal anything," Zara said. "I was doing my job. I found anomalies and I reported them, which is what I'm supposed to do." "You reported them to the wrong person," Viktor said. "That's the difficulty. Your colleague became our colleague before you fully understood what it was that you had discovered. And now we have a situation where you possess knowledge that is valuable and dangerous in equal measure." The car turned onto a street that Zara did not recognize. She was not native to Seoul, had moved to the city for her job, and while she had learned the geography of the central districts well enough to navigate her work life, there were entire sections of the city that remained foreign to her, that remained places where she would be lost if she needed to find her way. She understood that this was deliberate, that Viktor had chosen a route through the city designed to confuse her, designed to make her understand that she did not control the space around her, that she was dependent on his goodwill for her ability to return to any location she recognized. "What do you want?" she asked. "What we want is for you to understand something," Viktor said. "We want you to understand that the information you have compiled, the data you have analyzed, the patterns you have identified, all of that is now the property of interests that will make very effective use of it. We want you to understand that your employer, Crimson Analytics, will be receiving word that your contract is being terminated, that you are a security risk, that you have been engaged in unauthorized investigation of clients and have violated your confidentiality agreements. We want you to understand that your professional reputation, such as it is being dismantled as we speak." Zara felt something cold settle in her stomach. She understood what was happening. She was being destroyed. Not physically, at least not yet, but systematically and thoroughly. Her career was being ended. Her professional credibility was being revoked. She was being rendered unemployable within any legitimate organization, which meant that her leverage had been converted into liability. She had nothing left to bargain with. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "You won't," Viktor said. "Because the alternative is much worse. We can arrange for you to disappear. We can arrange for you to be found in ways that suggest you made poor decisions. We can arrange for your parents in Busan to understand that your disappearance will have been your own fault, the natural consequence of your refusal to cooperate. Or you can accept the offer that we are making you. Which is that you work for us. You take your considerable skills and your understanding of financial systems and you apply them to helping us understand our own operations better. You become the person who helps us identify problems in our network before those problems become visible to authorities. You become valuable in ways that make it worthwhile for us to keep you alive." The car had begun to drive faster. They were on one of the expressways now, moving away from the city center, moving toward destinations that Zara could not anticipate. She understood that she was in genuine danger, that the conversation she was having with Viktor Razin was not actually a conversation at all but rather a presentation of a decision that had already been made, that she was being informed of what her life would become rather than being offered a genuine choice about whether to accept these terms. "I need to think about this," she said. "No, you don't," Viktor replied. "You need to understand that you have already made your choice by getting into this car. Every moment you spend in this vehicle, you are confirming your decision to work with us. The people who matter already understand this. Your parents will be contacted within the week and informed that you have decided to take employment with an international firm and will be relocating to a position that requires significant travel and minimal contact with your previous life. Your apartment will be emptied. Your possessions will be stored or disposed of according to your instructions. Your previous life will be dismantled and rebuilt in a way that allows you to disappear into the network of people who serve my organization." "This is kidnapping," Zara said. The word felt inadequate to the reality of what was happening, but she said it anyway, needing to name the thing that was occurring. "This is business," Viktor corrected her. "And you, Miss Chen, whether you accept it or not, are now part of that business. You have 15 minutes to resign yourself to this reality, and then we are going to discuss the specific parameters of your employment." The car continued to move through the night. Zara tried to calculate where they might be headed based on the direction of travel and the time it was taking, but the expressway system in Seoul was complex enough that she quickly became disoriented. She understood that this was also deliberate, that she was being positioned in a state of uncertainty and confusion that would make it easier for Viktor to control her, that would make her more compliant with whatever came next. She thought about trying to escape, about attempting to open the door and leap from the moving vehicle, but she recognized the fantasy in that thought, understood that these cars were equipped with child locks, that she would not be able to escape simply by force. Instead, she sat in the soft leather seat and felt the cold creeping into her bones and understood that the life she had built, the carefully constructed existence in Seoul with her well-paying job and her small apartment and her routines and her plans, all of that had been an illusion. It had been fragile enough that a single discovery, a single decision to report what she had found, had been sufficient to demolish it entirely. She had made one choice, the choice to tell her colleague about the financial anomalies, and that single choice had cascaded through her life with the force of an avalanche, destroying everything in its path. The car eventually pulled into a garage. The door came down behind them with a sound that suggested finality, suggested that the threshold from the outside world to the inside world had been crossed and would not be easily reversed. Viktor stood and gestured for Zara to follow him. She followed because what else could she do? She was in a garage with no one around except a driver she did not know and a man who controlled her present and apparently her future. She followed Viktor into an elevator and up to what she assumed was a high floor based on the amount of time the elevator climbed. When the doors opened, she found herself in a penthouse suite that overlooked the city, that commanded a view of Seoul spreading out in all directions, that positioned her above the world she had known and simultaneously cut her off from it completely. "This will be your living space," Viktor said. "You will be given appropriate technology to conduct your work. You will have communication with the outside world that is carefully monitored. You will be paid more money than you ever imagined, and you will be expected to use that money to purchase nothing that indicates dissatisfaction with your circumstances. You will maintain the appearance of a person who has voluntarily withdrawn from society. You will not contact your previous associates. You will not attempt to communicate with your family beyond the approved channels. You will essentially become invisible, a ghost in the machinery of the organization, and you will be compensated handsomely for your service." Zara walked to the window. The city sprawled below her, millions of lives being lived simultaneously, millions of people engaging with their daily existence, unaware of the woman who had just been removed from their world and deposited into a space that was simultaneously luxurious and absolutely imprisoning. She pressed her hand against the glass and felt the cold of it, felt the solidity of it, understood that glass was actually quite difficult to break if you were alone and unprepared. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked. "I already told you what happens if you refuse," Viktor said. "I don't repeat myself, Ms. Chen. I suggest you understand that this is your reality now. I suggest you begin the process of accepting what has occurred and focusing your energy on performing your work well enough that I don't decide that you're more trouble than you're worth." Questions. Zara did not have questions. She had many things she wanted to say, many things she wanted to express about the injustice of the situation, about the violation of her autonomy, about the particular cruelty of removing someone from their life without their consent. But she understood that none of those words would matter, that Viktor Razin had heard variations of this complaint thousands of times and was unmoved by it. Instead, she turned from the window and looked at him and said the only thing she could think of. "I want to contact my parents." "Not yet," Viktor said. "We will arrange that. In the meantime, you will rest. You will adjust. You will begin to understand your new circumstances. Tomorrow we will discuss the technical specifications of your work environment. For tonight, you will be given quarters and you will remain here." He left her in the penthouse. There were guards outside, she understood, even though she did not see them. There were certainly surveillance systems monitoring every room, recording every movement, ensuring that she did not attempt to do something foolish like trying to escape from a penthouse that was 60 stories above the street. She explored the space methodically, the way she explored data, looking for patterns, searching for weaknesses, attempting to understand the architecture of her imprisonment. The quarters were elegant. There was a bedroom with a bed that was more comfortable than any bed she had slept in before. There was a bathroom with expensive toiletries. There was a kitchen stocked with food. There was a living area with a television and books and the trappings of a comfortable life. It was, she understood, the most comfortable prison possible. And that understanding was what made it so terrible. She spent the first night in this new space unable to sleep, lying in the comfortable bed and listening to the sounds of the city below, listening to the sounds of a world she was no longer part of. She thought about her parents and what they would be told when Viktor's people contacted them. She thought about her job and who would take over her responsibilities. She thought about the small apartment she had rented and whether her landlord would attempt to contact her. She thought about the fact that she had no one in Seoul who would miss her enough to call the police when she did not return home, that she was, in effect, disposable, that her removal from the world would create barely a ripple. The next morning, Viktor arrived with a team of technicians. They set up her work environment: banks of computers, sophisticated data analysis software, secure servers that would allow her to access the financial systems she needed to monitor without those systems being traceable back to this location. They explained to her what she would be doing: monitoring the organization's financial flows, identifying regulatory risks, predicting how authorities might detect their activities, and suggesting ways to obscure those activities further. She would be helping a criminal organization become more efficient at crime. She would be using her analytical skills to make exploitation and trafficking and money laundering more profitable and harder to detect. "What if I don't do this?" she asked Viktor when they were alone again. "Then we remove you from the penthouse and place you somewhere less pleasant," he said. "And if you continue to be uncooperative, we remove you from the city. And if you still persist in your resistance, we remove you from the world. These are not threats, Ms. Chen. These are simply the logical consequences of refusing to cooperate with someone who holds absolute power over your circumstances." So she did the work. She became the person that Viktor Razin had determined she would become. He analyzed data. She identified patterns. She suggested optimizations. She transformed her considerable analytical skills into tools that served criminality. And in doing so, she became something that she had not expected to become: complicit, compromised, and fundamentally trapped in a situation from which there seemed no escape. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into nearly a year. Zara lived in the penthouse, worked in the workspace that had been created for her, ate food that appeared magically in the kitchen, slept in the comfortable bed, and slowly began to forget what her previous life had been like. This was the particular danger of her situation. That prolonged captivity slowly normalized the conditions of captivity. That time was a tool in the hands of people who wanted to make you accept your situation, that humans were adaptable creatures who could eventually convince themselves that almost any circumstance was the way things had always been. She was allowed, eventually, to contact her parents. The conversations were brief and monitored. Her mother asked if she was happy. Her father asked when she would be coming home. She made up stories about her work, about the firm she supposedly worked for, about the reasons she was staying in Seoul. And slowly, the conversations became less frequent, became shorter, became conversations between people who were no longer quite certain what they had in common. Then one evening, about 11 months after she had gotten into Viktor Razin's car, there was a disturbance in the building. She heard gunfire, distant but distinct, the sound of violence echoing through the structure. She heard shouting. She heard the particular chaos that comes when something organized is suddenly disrupted. She did not understand what was happening, but she understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful order of her imprisonment had been compromised. The door to her quarters crashed open. A man she did not recognize grabbed her arm and pulled her from the space she had been occupying. "Come on," he said. "We need to move. Now." She did not ask questions. She did not attempt to resist. She simply allowed herself to be pulled through the penthouse and toward the elevator. But before they could reach it, there was another crash, the sound of an explosion, the sensation of the building shaking. The man who had been pulling her swore in Russian and changed direction, pulling her toward the stairwell instead. They descended rapidly, her heart pounding, her breath coming in quick gasps. The stairwell led them down to what appeared to be a garage level. There were cars here, expensive vehicles, the kind that belonged to people of means, the kind that suggested they had multiple escape routes prepared for multiple scenarios. The man pulled her toward one of them, an armored Mercedes, and opened the rear door. "Get in," he said. She got in. The interior of this car was different from the interior of Viktor Razin's car, though it was equally expensive, equally designed for the transport of important people. There was someone else already in the rear seat. A man who was younger than Viktor, who had a severity about him that suggested he had been trained for violence, who looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. "Who is she?" the man asked in Russian. Then he repeated the question in English, apparently for her benefit. "Security consultant," the driver said in Russian, clearly assuming she did not understand the language. But Zara had learned Russian during her months in the penthouse, had studied it using the books and applications available to her, had slowly built her capability with the language because understanding the language of her captors was a kind of power, a kind of advantage in a situation where advantages were rare. The car had begun to move. She felt the acceleration and understood that they were leaving, that whatever was happening in the building above them was severe enough to warrant evacuation. She looked at the man next to her and realized, with a start that was almost physical, that she recognized him. His picture had appeared in briefings that Viktor had shown her, photographs of rival organizations, of people who posed threats to the Razin network, of enemies who might at any moment become problems that needed solving. "You're Dmitry Sokolov," she said. It was a statement, not a question. The man turned to look at her, and his expression shifted from indifference to interest. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. Someone who was kidnapped by Viktor Razin and forced to work as a data analyst for his organization, she said. She was speaking in English, which meant she was being deliberate about this, was choosing to communicate in a language that the driver would understand, that would make this conversation something other than a private exchange. And I'm guessing by the fact that I'm in your car and we're leaving that building that Viktor Razin's organization is currently being dismantled by federal authorities or by whoever you work for. Dmitry Sokolov was studying her now with an intensity that suggested she had become significantly more interesting to him in the space of a few seconds. "What's your name?" he asked. "Zara Chen. I was a data analyst for Crimson Analytics before Viktor decided that I knew too much and that it would be more efficient to kidnap me and force me to work for him than to kill me." "And have you been helping him?" Dmitry asked. "Have you been using your skills to advance his organization?" "Yes," Zara said. There was no point in lying, no point in pretending that she had resisted, that she had been a hero in her own story. "I did exactly what he told me to do. I was complicit in everything." The car was moving fast now. She could feel it maneuvering through traffic, could feel the particular violence of rapid acceleration and sudden braking that suggested they were being pursued, or at least that the driver believed they might be pursued. The sounds of the city outside seemed chaotic, seemed different from the normal sounds of Seoul traffic. She realized that the building was being raided, that law enforcement was engaged in arresting people, that somewhere in the machinery of organized crime Viktor Razin's network was being dismantled. "What was your leverage over him?" Dmitry asked. "What did you have that made you valuable enough to kidnap rather than kill?" "I had discovered financial irregularities in his money laundering operations," Zara explained. "I was analyzing data for a legitimate firm and I found anomalies that led me to understand how his network worked. He decided that it would be useful to have me helping him identify problems before authorities found them." "Did you?" Dmitry asked. "Did you help him identify problems?" "Yes," she said. "And I helped him develop systems to obscure his activities further. I made his organization more efficient at crime." Dmitry nodded slowly, and she understood that he was processing this information, was considering whether she was a liability or an asset, was calculating what her usefulness might be to him. He was the kind of person who made strategic decisions quickly, who did not allow emotion or sentiment to interfere with logic. He was the kind of person she was beginning to understand, who was very much like Viktor, who was driven by the same logic of power and control and the ruthless pursuit of advantage. "What's happening?" she asked. "Why are we leaving? What happened to Viktor?" "Viktor is being arrested," Dmitry said, "along with most of his senior organization. The federal authorities have been investigating his network for 3 years. They finally had enough evidence and made their move approximately 40 minutes ago. His penthouse was hit simultaneously with raids on his other locations across the city. He is, for practical purposes, finished." "And you are?" Zara asked. "His primary competitor," Dmitry said. "My organization has been attempting to dismantle the Razin network for years. Today we succeeded. Which means that his assets, his territory, his business operations, and his personnel are now available for acquisition by whoever is positioned to take advantage of them most effectively." The car turned sharply and Zara felt her body move with the momentum. Outside, the night had taken on a strange quality, seemed filled with the particular electricity that comes in the moments when established structures are being dismantled and something new is emerging to replace them. She understood that she had been placed in yet another car with yet another criminal, that she was being transported yet again to yet another destination, that her prison was changing shape and location but was not fundamentally different. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "That depends," Dmitry said, "on whether you want to continue working for people who are in the business of crime, or whether you want to do something else with your life." "I don't see that I have a choice," Zara said. "I seem to be a person who is selected by criminals and forced to work for them. Perhaps that's simply my role in the world." "Everyone has a choice," Dmitry said. "The choice is not always between good options and bad options. Sometimes the choice is between bad options and worse options. But there is always a choice." The car pulled into an underground garage that was similar to the garage where Viktor had kept her before. The doors came down, sealing them in. Dmitry gestured for her to follow him, and she did, moving from the car into an elevator that ascended into a building that was equally impressive and equally cold as the penthouse where she had been held before. But this time when they emerged into the space, something was different. There were windows, and beyond those windows the city was still visible, still present. There was technology here as well, but it was arranged differently, was organized with a precision that suggested a different kind of mind, a different kind of approach to the creation of order. And there were other people here, analysts and strategists and people who appeared to understand both the world of finance and the world of crime. "I'm going to make you an offer," Dmitri said. "You have worked for Viktor Razin. You know his systems. You know how he organized his financial operations. You know the patterns of his money laundering. This knowledge is valuable to me. I'm offering you the choice to remain in my employ and continue doing the work you have been doing, except this time for an organization that is slightly more organized than the one you've been working for. Or I can arrange for your release. I can provide you with a new identity, with resources, with the ability to disappear into a new life somewhere far from Seoul. But understand, if you choose the second option, if you choose to leave and attempt to build a new life, you will be doing so with the knowledge that you have worked for the Razin organization, that you have made decisions that have affected thousands of people, that you cannot simply pretend that your complicity did not occur." Zara walked to the window. This building was also high, also positioned above the city, also commanded a view that positioned you above the world of normal people. She understood that she was being offered a choice, but that the choice was genuinely between different forms of the same essential trap. If she worked for Dmitri, she would be continuing to be complicit in crime. If she left, she would be carrying the weight of her prior complicity wherever she went, would be a person with knowledge that made her dangerous, would be unable to return to any kind of normal existence because she would be marked by what she had experienced. "I need to think about this," she said. "No, you don't," Dmitri replied. "I'm going to give you a choice, but I'm not going to give you unlimited time to make it. You have until dawn. By the time the sun rises on this city, you need to have decided whether you're staying or leaving. If you're staying, you'll begin orientation into the operations of my organization. If you're leaving, we will arrange your exit and provide you with the resources you need. But you will decide now, or I will decide for you." This was the pattern she understood. This was how criminals operated. This was how they took control of situations and transformed agency into the appearance of agency, how they created the illusion of choice while eliminating the actual conditions under which choice could meaningfully exist. You could choose to cooperate or choose not to cooperate, could choose to stay or choose to leave, but the fundamental architecture of the decision had been constructed by someone else, and all of your options led to outcomes that had been predetermined by a person with power over your circumstances. She spent the night in another comfortable space, in another room designed to be both luxurious and imprisoning. She looked at her options and understood that there was no good choice available to her. She could leave and become a ghost, a person living on a false identity, never able to return to her life or her family, always aware of the harm she had caused, always understanding that she was complicit in exploitation and trafficking and violence. Or she could stay and become a more conscious participant in that exploitation, would be doing her work with the full knowledge of what it served, would be making a deliberate choice to advance the interests of crime every single day. By dawn, she had made her decision. She had decided that she could not continue to participate in the network, that she could not allow herself to become further entrenched in the machinery of organized crime, that even though leaving meant accepting a kind of exile, even though it meant living with the weight of her prior complicity forever, it was the only choice that she could make and still maintain some fundamental integrity. She went to find Dmitri. She found him in a command center of sorts, a room filled with screens and data and the particular architecture of surveillance and control. He was reviewing financial information, was absorbed in the business of taking over Viktor Razin's territory, was so focused on the work that he did not notice her approach until she was standing directly in front of him. "I want to leave," she said. "I want the new identity and the resources and the exit." Dmitri looked at her with an expression that suggested he had expected this choice, had perhaps predicted it the moment he had seen her in Viktor's car. "You understand that by leaving you're making yourself a liability?" he asked. "You understand that I could simply arrange for you to disappear entirely rather than allowing you to walk away with knowledge of both the Razin organization and my organization?" "Yes," she said. "I understand. But I'm asking anyway. I'm asking because I can't continue this. I can't continue being complicit in what I've been complicit in. I can't continue helping people commit violence and exploitation and trafficking. I'd rather be a ghost than continue doing that." Dmitri studied her for a long moment. Then very slowly he smiled. "I respect that," he said. "I respect the decision. It's impractical, it's foolish. It's the kind of decision that a person makes when they still believe in concepts like morality and integrity. But I respect it. He made some phone calls. Within a few hours, Zara had been provided with documents, with money, with information about bank accounts that she could access. She had been given a new name, Elena Marchetti, and the backstory that would support that name, the documentation that would allow her to exist in the world as a person who had never worked for organized crime, who had no connection to anything illegal, who was simply a woman who had decided to relocate and start a new life. "Where are you going?" Dmitri asked as she was leaving. "I don't know yet," she said. "Somewhere far from Seoul. Somewhere where no one knows who I was before." "You'll carry it with you regardless," he said. "But perhaps that's part of the punishment, part of the consequence of the choices you made. You'll be alive, but you'll always know what you did. You'll know that you helped facilitate the exploitation of thousands of people. You'll know that you used your intelligence to serve criminality. That knowledge will follow you. That understanding will be the weight you carry for the rest of your life." Zara nodded. He accepted this. She understood that she was not escaping consequences, only transforming them into a different shape, a different configuration. She was choosing to live as a ghost rather than continue to live as a collaborator, but the ghosts that haunted her would be the people she had harmed, the lives that had been affected by the work she had done, the countless individuals whose suffering had been made more profitable and more efficient by her analytical skills. She left the building at dawn. Dmitri had arranged for a car to take her to the airport, had provided her with a ticket under her new name, had set her on a path toward Thailand, toward Bangkok, toward a city where she could disappear into crowds of tourists and expatriates and people living lives that existed partially outside the normal structures of society. She sat in the car and watched Seoul pass by, watched the city that had been her home transform back into the city of strangers, watched the morning light gradually illuminate the places where she had built her previous life. At the airport, she passed through security under her new identity. No one questioned her. No one seemed to notice that she was traveling with minimal luggage, that her documentation was recently created, that she was a woman who had been erased from her previous existence and was now in the process of being erased even further, was approaching the threshold where the person she had been would cease to exist entirely except in her own memory, except in the private knowledge she carried of who she really was. She boarded the plane. As it took off, she looked down at Seoul and felt a complicated mixture of emotions that she did not attempt to untangle. She felt relief at escaping her captivity. She felt guilt at the harm she had caused. She felt loss at the life she had left behind. She felt fear about what came next. And underneath all of that, she felt the particular exhaustion that comes from making choices that have genuine consequences, from accepting that you cannot undo the past, that you can only move forward carrying the weight of what you have done. Bangkok was hot and humid and overwhelming in its difference from Seoul. She had never been to Thailand before, and she wandered the streets of the old city in a kind of daze, experiencing everything as if it were happening to someone else, as if she were watching a woman named Elena Marchetti navigate a world that this woman had just inherited. She found a small apartment in a neighborhood where Westerners and expatriates lived, paid cash for the deposit and the first month's rent, and began the process of constructing a new existence. The work became what sustained her. She found employment at a small business analytics firm, used her genuine skills to help local businesses understand their financial operations. She was good at the work, was excellent at analyzing data and identifying patterns, and because she was excellent, she was valuable, and because she was valuable, people did not ask too many questions about her background or her history. She became a person who had a job, who had an apartment, who had a routine. She became Elena Marchetti. But the nights were difficult. The nights were when Zara Chen emerged, when she allowed herself to remember who she had been before, when she thought about the people she had harmed, when she understood with absolute clarity that she could not undo what she had done, that no amount of distance or time or geographic separation would change the fact that she had made choices that had hurt people. She began to research the Razin organization, began to follow the legal proceedings against Viktor, began to understand the scope of the network she had helped make more efficient. There had been women in the trafficking network. Dozens of them from countries across Eastern Europe and Asia, brought to Korea under false pretenses, held in facilities, forced into labor and exploitation. She had helped fund these operations. She had helped make them more profitable. She had used her analytical skills to ensure that authorities would not detect them. The weight of this understanding became almost physical, became something that pressed down on her with the force of genuine gravity. A year after leaving Seoul, she made a decision. She contacted a legal advocacy group that worked on human trafficking cases. She provided them with information about the Razin organization's structure, about the financial flows that had funded the trafficking operations, about the patterns of money laundering that had disguised the profits from exploitation. She did this anonymously, through encrypted channels, through intermediaries who protected her identity. But she did it. She began the process of attempting to undo, to the extent that undoing was possible, some of the harm that she had caused. The federal authorities used this information. Viktor Razin's conviction was based partially on the evidence that Zara provided, though her name never appeared anywhere, though she was never identified as a source, though she remained a ghost giving testimony from beyond the grave of her previous identity. She watched from Bangkok as the man who had kidnapped her was sentenced to 42 years in prison, as his organization was dismantled entirely, as the women in the trafficking network were identified and provided with support and advocacy. It was not redemption. She understood that clearly. Redemption implied that you could undo harm, that you could make things right, that you could return to a state of innocence or cleanness. But you could not. You could only acknowledge what you had done, could only attempt to prevent further harm, could only carry the weight of your complicity forever. This was the consequence that Dmitri had spoken about, and it was real in a way that most consequences were not. It was internal. It was permanent. It was something that no amount of geographic distance could change. 2 years after leaving Seoul, Zara received a message. It came through encrypted channels, came from an address that she did not recognize but that contained information that only someone who had been in Viktor's penthouse could possibly know. The message was brief. It said, "You have been offered another choice. Not by Viktor. Not by me. But by the federal authorities. You can come forward. You can testify in open court about your knowledge of the Razin organization's operations. You can be identified publicly as the source of the information that has been used to convict him and dismantle his network. Or you can remain a ghost. But we both know that ghosts are not sustainable. Eventually, even ghosts have to choose between appearing or disappearing entirely." Dmitri. The message made her understand something that she had been avoiding for 2 years. She could not run forever. She could not remain Elena Marchetti indefinitely while Zara Chen remained dead. At some point she would have to choose to resurface, to become visible again, to allow the person she had been and the person she had become to reconcile with each other. The question was whether she would do it voluntarily or whether she would be forced to do it by circumstances beyond her control. She contacted the federal authorities. She identified herself. She explained that she had been kidnapped by Viktor Razin and forced to work for his organization. She provided them with testimony about the financial systems, about the money laundering operations, about the structure of the organization. She appeared in court and she spoke publicly about her complicity and her escape. She transformed herself from a ghost into a witness, and in doing so she reclaimed the possibility of a genuine future. The testimony was devastating to Viktor's case, or rather, it was confirmatory of what had already been established but provided crucial details about the inner workings of his organization. She became a person whose name appeared in court documents, whose identity was no longer hidden, whose story became part of the public record. And in doing this she discovered something unexpected. That visibility could be a kind of freedom, that speaking about what had happened could be a kind of power, that refusing to remain a ghost could be a kind of choice. After the trial ended, after Viktor Razin had been convicted and sentenced, Zara made another choice. She returned to Seoul. She obtained a visa, she booked a flight, she came back to the city that had been both her home and her prison. She did this not because she needed to come back, but because returning felt like reclaiming something, felt like refusing to allow her trauma to define the geography of her life. She walked through the Gangnam district. She visited the location where the Christmas market had been, where she had been approached by Viktor's representative. She stood in that space and remembered the person she had been before everything had changed, and she understood that person with compassion rather than judgment. She found work as a financial analyst again, but this time she worked for a firm that specialized in investigating financial crime, that used the kind of analytical work she had done for criminals in order to expose financial crime. She became a person who used her skills to harm exploitation rather than to facilitate it. She became a person who had transformed her complicity into something that approximated redemption, understanding always that redemption was something that had to be earned continuously, something that could never be fully achieved, something that required vigilance and commitment and the constant choosing to do the right thing in the face of situations where the easy path would have been to remain complicit. She did not contact her parents immediately. She did not want their pity or their shock or their confusion about where she had been and what had happened to her. But eventually she did contact them. She told them a version of the truth, that she had been kidnapped by a criminal, that she had escaped, that she had testified in a trial, that she was rebuilding her life. She did not tell them about the work she had done for the Razin organization, about the fact that she had been complicit in trafficking and money laundering, about the weight she carried. She simply told them that she was alive and that she was working to make things right. Her mother wept when she called. Her father asked if she needed anything, if she needed money, if she needed help. And Zara realized that despite everything, despite her absence and the complications of her return, they still wanted to help her, still understood her as their daughter, still loved her in the way that parents love children even when those children have done terrible things, have made terrible choices, have been harmed in ways that change them fundamentally. 5 years after she had gotten into Viktor Razin's car on a Christmas market evening, Zara Chen was offered a choice that surprised her. Dmitry Sokolov contacted her. He arranged to meet with her in a coffee shop in the Gangnam district, and when she arrived she found him sitting at a table overlooking the street, looking older than she remembered him, looking like a man who had spent years managing an empire and had discovered that empires were more difficult to maintain than they were to build. "I'm leaving the business," he said without preamble. "I'm retiring. I'm moving to a place where the reach of organized crime is limited and where I can live a relatively normal life. I'm doing this because I've realized something that took me a long time to understand. That power that comes from exploitation is unstable power, that it requires constant reinforcement through violence and intimidation, that there is no peaceful existence possible when you're built your life on a foundation of other people's suffering." Zara listened to him speak and understood that he was not asking her for anything, was not attempting to convince her of anything. He was simply sharing information, was opening a window into his own thought process, was allowing her to see the person beneath the criminal veneer. "I'm telling you this because I wanted you to know that I respect what you did," Dmitry continued. "I respect the choice you made to leave. I respect the fact that you eventually came forward and testified. And I wanted you to know that I'm doing something similar now in my own way. I'm dismantling my organization. I'm cooperating with authorities. I'm attempting, in whatever limited way is possible, to undo some of the harm that I have caused." "Why?" Zara asked. "Because I discovered what you seem to have discovered much more quickly, that there is no peace in the pursuit of power. There is only the constant hunger for more, the constant fear of being displaced, the constant knowledge that the people you've harmed will eventually catch up with you. I'm choosing to step out of that cycle before it destroys me entirely." Dmitry left Seoul that week. Years later, Zara would learn that he had relocated to a small village in the mountains of northern Thailand, that he had purchased land and had begun to fund schools and hospitals in rural communities, that he had transformed himself from a crime boss into someone attempting to use his remaining resources to do positive work in the world. She did not know if this transformation was genuine or if it was theater designed to ease his conscience, but she chose to believe that it was genuine because believing that people could change, that choices could be remade, that it was possible to move away from darkness toward light, even if that movement was incomplete and imperfect and took a lifetime, was the only way she could continue to live with herself. The years that followed were years of reconstruction. Zara became a respected analyst at her firm, became someone known for her integrity, became a person who was called to testify in cases involving financial crime, organized crime, money laundering. She worked with law enforcement. She worked with advocacy organizations. She worked with women who had been trafficked and exploited, helping them understand the financial systems that had been used to profit from their suffering. She gave speeches about financial crime. She wrote articles. She became a person whose knowledge and experience and moral transformation were directed toward exposing and preventing the kind of harm that she had once facilitated. But she never entirely escaped the weight of what she had done. There were nights when she would remember specific decisions she had made while working for Viktor, when she would think about specific operations she had made more efficient, when she would understand with perfect clarity that somewhere in the world, there were women who had experienced suffering specifically because of her work, specifically because she had used her analytical skills to make exploitation more profitable. This knowledge never left her. It was the price of her existence. It was the thing she carried forever, the weight that she had agreed to carry when she chose to leave and chose to survive. On the 20th anniversary of the Christmas market evening, when she had gotten into Viktor's car, Zara stood in front of a room full of people. Law enforcement officials, advocacy workers, students training to become financial analysts, journalists interested in the story of organized crime. She spoke about her experience. She spoke about how she had been kidnapped. She spoke about the work she had done for a criminal organization. She spoke about how she had escaped and had eventually testified. She spoke about the consequences of complicity. She spoke about the importance of integrity. She spoke about the fact that everyone was capable of being drawn into situations where doing the wrong thing seemed like the only option available, and that the responsibility of individuals was to resist that pull, to choose differently, to understand that the convenience of moral compromise was always more expensive than the difficulty of moral integrity. When she finished speaking, a young woman approached her. The young woman had been trafficked by the Razin organization when she was 19 years old, had been held in one of the facilities, had been exploited, had eventually been freed during the federal raid that had dismantled Viktor's network. She told Zara that she had wanted to meet her because she wanted to understand the person whose work had been used to profit from her suffering. She wanted to know if Zara felt guilty. She wanted to know if Zara had attempted to make it right. She wanted to know if redemption was possible for someone who had been complicit in her exploitation. Zara did not have good answers to these questions. She could not say that she did not feel guilty because she did feel guilty, would feel guilty for the rest of her life. She could not say that she had made it entirely right because you could never make exploitation entirely right, because the harm that had been caused was permanent in ways that no amount of restitution could repair. She could only say that she had tried, that she had spent 20 years attempting to prevent the same harm from happening to others, that she understood the weight of her complicity and was trying to transform that understanding into something that approximated justice. The young woman listened to her speak and nodded slowly. "I'm not forgiving you," she said. "I think you should understand that. What happened to me, what happened because of your work. I'm not going to forgive that. But I understand that you're trying. And I appreciate that you're trying." This conversation stayed with Zara. It became the thing she held on to during moments of despair, became the thing she returned to when she was questioning whether her continued existence was justified. She understood that forgiveness was not the point, that the point was simply to refuse to allow exploitation to continue, to use whatever power and resources she had to prevent future harm, to be honest about the weight of her prior complicity while refusing to allow that weight to paralyze her. The Christmas market in Seoul was held again that year, as it had been held every year for the past 20 years. Zara went to the market again, walked through the crowds of people purchasing gifts and hot chocolate and roasted chestnuts. She walked to the location where she had been approached by Viktor's representative all those years ago. She stood in that space and remembered the moment when her life had changed, when she had made the choice to get into the car, when she had understood that the world was more complex and more dangerous than she had previously believed. A man approached her as she was standing there. He was in his 60s, weathered, with eyes that held some quality she could not quite identify. He asked her if she was waiting for someone. She said that she was not, that she was simply remembering something that had happened a long time ago in this location. The man nodded and said that he understood, that this place held many memories for many people, that sometimes people came back to the places where their lives had changed in order to understand how the change had occurred. He left before she could respond. But as he was leaving, she caught a glimpse of his face, and she understood with absolute certainty that it had been Dmitry Sokolov. He had returned to Seoul, or perhaps he had never truly left, or perhaps the distinction between returning and not returning was not actually important. What was important was that he was here, was acknowledging the space and the time in which their lives had intersected, was recognizing that they were both people who had been transformed by the choices they had made in this city at this particular moment in time. She looked for him in the crowd, but he had disappeared. Perhaps he had actually been there, or perhaps her mind had simply constructed his appearance as a kind of final piece of understanding, a final moment of recognition between two people who had understood each other's capacity for transformation, for redemption, for the choosing to be different than what their circumstances had made them. What had happened on that Christmas market evening was simple and complicated in equal measure. Zara had gotten into the wrong car, or perhaps the right car. Or perhaps there was no such thing as the wrong or right car, and there were only choices and consequences and the slow unfolding of a person's response to those choices and consequences. She had been kidnapped. She had been held captive. She had been forced to participate in the exploitation of vulnerable people. She had escaped. She had become a witness. She had been transformed by these experiences and had chosen to allow that transformation to serve justice rather than cruelty. She had learned that ghosts were not sustainable, that at some point you had to choose to appear or to disappear entirely, and that appearing, with all the pain and vulnerability that appearing entailed, was a choice that allowed for the possibility of genuine life. She had learned that complicity was not a permanent condition, that you could choose to stop participating in harm, that you could begin the long process of attempting to prevent the same harm from happening to others. She had learned that the world was darker than she had previously understood, that power could be used to exploit and control, that systems of crime could flourish in the spaces between legitimate institutions. But she had also learned that it was possible to resist that darkness, that it was possible to choose differently, that it was possible to build a life that was directed toward preventing exploitation rather than facilitating it. On her walk away from the Christmas market that evening, Zara Chen thought about the young woman who had approached her after her speech, who had said that she was not forgiving her but understood that she was trying. She thought about how this was perhaps the closest thing to redemption that was actually possible. Not forgiveness, not the erasure of harm, but the acknowledgement that someone was trying, that someone had transformed their understanding of what they had done and was directing their subsequent life toward preventing future harm. She thought about Viktor Razin, aging in prison, his empire dismantled, his power rendered meaningless. She thought about Dmitry Sokolov, whatever his current circumstances, whatever his current location, having chosen to step away from the machinery of organized crime. She thought about all the people whose lives had been affected by the choices that had been made that Christmas market evening, by the choice to get into the car, by the subsequent choices that had followed. And she understood that this was the story that needed to be told. Not a story of simple heroism or simple villainy, but a story of people making choices within constrained circumstances, people being transformed by those choices, people understanding the weight of their complicity and their power and their ability to change direction. This was the story of how a woman had gotten into the wrong car and had discovered that the car had been both her captivity and the beginning of her ability to reclaim her autonomy and her integrity. If you were Zara in that moment when the car door opened and Viktor Razin gestured for you to enter, would you have gotten in? Would you have made the choice to accept the ride of someone whose intentions toward you were unclear? What would you have done if you found yourself in a car with someone who held power over your life? What choices would you have made differently? What would your first words have been in that moment of crisis? These are the questions that matter because they ask us to consider what we would do in the face of captivity, what choices we would make when confronted with our own vulnerability, what transformation is possible when we are forced to understand the true nature of the world and the systems we participate in. Tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? Have you ever been forced to make a difficult choice between complicity and resistance? What would you have done in Zara's position? We're aiming for 16,000 likes on this video. Let's reach it together. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because next time, we're diving into what happened when Dmitry Sokolov decided to abandon the criminal underworld entirely and attempted to use his remaining resources and power to repair some of the damage that he and his organization had caused. We'll explore the story of how a crime boss became a philanthropist, how a man who had built his empire on exploitation attempted to reverse that legacy, and how the people he had harmed responded to his transformation. We'll see what happens when someone finally understands that the power they have built is destroying them from the inside, that the only way to survive is to step away completely and rebuild themselves entirely. The wrong car led to the right understanding. The captivity led to the possibility of freedom. The harm led to the possibility of healing. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this story. And remember, our choices define us not once but constantly, and redemption is not a destination but a direction, not something we achieve but something we choose to move toward every single day.